12 through verse 22, there is some exhortations to orderly living and obedience. The first two verses, 12 and 13, deal with a view toward elders. And that's what we were discussing last week. Paul pleads with them to know the elders, those overseeing the work of the Lord in that location. Because elders have the responsibility, the obligation of overseeing them and admonishing them. The idea of know, we mentioned last week, it is used in the sense of having care for, regarding them, appreciating them, valuing them. And he's telling the Thessalonian brethren, you do that in relationship to those who are elders there. It would also involve paying the proper respect for them. Elders labor among them. Labor is a word that means grow weary by working or exhausted and implies hard work. And when you consider the work of elders, it's not physical labor, but it certainly is mental labor. There is a mental aspect to being an elder that stays with one all the time. I mean, it's not just when he comes here or when there's an elders meeting. It is something that's on his mind. If he's doing the Lord's work, it's going to be on his mind all the time. There is a great deal of pressure in relationship to the work in which he is involved in. They do have spiritual leadership, not physical leadership or worldly, dealing with worldly matters. But they have the spiritual leadership of those under their care. And that's what we would see in Hebrews 13 and verse 17, to obey them that have the rule over you and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they that must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable unto you. They have a care for the souls that are under their care, and thus a spiritual leadership. That leadership includes deacons. It includes all of the members, and it includes the preacher or preachers. I have heard through the years that preachers almost boasting, the elders can't tell me what to preach. In a sense, that's true. In a sense, that's false. And keep you from preaching it by firing you, that's true. But with the elders having that spiritual oversight, they can tell. For example, if they believe that the congregation needs some lessons directed in this area, they call the preacher and say, we want you to preach a series or preach a lesson dealing with this subject. Now, does he have to do? Does he say, well, you can't tell me what to preach? Well, that's the attitude of a lot of preachers. Well, absolutely, they can tell you what to preach in that case. Now, what they're talking about generally, when they're using that, is when elderships try to prevent them from preaching the truth. And that does take place. It has in the past. I have no doubts it will in the future. And in that situation, elders cannot prevent me from preaching the truth. my responsibility and obligation to God as a preacher would be to preach the truth then, in spite of what the elders state. But if elders see a need for certain teaching in the congregation, they certainly have the right and obligation to tell the preacher, we want you to preach some sermons dealing with this subject. And that preacher must be in submission to the eldership, and he then must start working up some sermons on that subject and be preaching and presenting material on that subject. I will say, though, that sometimes you preach on a subject in a way that's different than what some people think. I was told of a congregation who they wanted a man to come for a meeting. And they wanted him to, really talk about, to a great extent, giving. Okay, you'd think a lot of lessons on money and how we're to give to. All of his sermons were on evangelism. Now, I see some strange looks. And what? He knew you preach on evangelism and people start giving. He preached on the subject they wanted preached on and dealt with it, but he did it in a way in which they weren't really prepared for. So that happens as well. I'm trying to think if the elders, while I was preaching before Tim came, if they ever told me to preach on something. I don't remember if they did. They basically left it up to me, as most elderships do, Dale.
Are you saying, making that comment about the reaction of the preacher preaching on evangelism in a favorable way, that you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay.
He did what the elders, that congregation, or the elders of that congregation asked him to do.
Okay.
He just did it in a way that they didn't expect. But he did what they wanted him to do. And the results were they ended up being pleased with the job that he did because their contribution increased, which is really what their intent was in asking him to preach on giving. So, but yes, elders oversee that aspect of the preacher's work, the deacon's work, and the members. But it is the spiritual aspect, not the physical. Do elders have the right as elders, and because they are watching for your souls, to go into your home, for example, and say, I want to see your finances. I want to see where you spend your money. I want to see what you buy and what you eat. And I figured I'd get a little bit more reaction on something like that. No, of course not. They don't have those rights because they don't oversee in the physical realm, the material realm. They oversee the spiritual realm. Do they have the right to go into your home and ask you, how are you studying the Bible? When are you doing so? Oh, now that's a different matter, wouldn't it? Because that's now dealing with your soul, and they're watching for your soul in that case. And so, yes, they would have that right. I'm not saying that they should. I'm just saying they would have the right to do so because they are watching for our souls. Okay, Dale?
Do you know any examples of specific examples of elders that have done what you just commented on just now? Done that?
As far as asking people what they do and when they study and things like that, not specifically from a general standpoint. I know of some elderships that have tried to basically take over control of people's lives. So, yes, that could happen. An elder could say, make the argument, we're caring for your soul. And to care for your soul properly, we have to know these things about you. We have to know your times of recreation. We need to know, and all of that. We need to know how you spend your money. Because all of those things affect your spirituality, is what they would argue. But there must be the use of some common sense about those things as well. That's not what Paul is speaking of here, obviously. They are not over you in that sense. They are over you in the making of decisions from a spiritual standpoint for your growth and development. Zohidus put it this way, by implication, dealing with this idea of over you, by implication meaning to care for something, to be diligent, to practice. They're caring for your soul. That's their job. Marvin Vincent, in his word studies, I think put something down that's interesting. The primitive Pauline church consisted of a number of separate fraternities which were self-governing. The recognition of those who ministered to the congregation depended on the free choice of their members. See, for instance, 1 Corinthians 16, 15, and 16. The congregation exercised discipline and gave judgment. 1 Corinthians 5, 3 through 5, 2 Corinthians 2, 6, 7, 2 Corinthians 7, 11, and 12, and Galatians 6, 1. He's right about that. That's not the way when he wrote, that's not the way congregations work, though. He wrote the truth about the primitive church. It consisted of a number of fraternities, separate fraternities that were self-governing.
What do you mean by the term fraternities?
Brotherhood.
Oh, brotherhood. Okay. That's what John 13, 34, 35 says, don't it? By this y'all may know that you're my disciples if you have loved one for another?
No.
That's not fraternity?
Fraternity would be a group of people who are members of the same organization.
Okay. Well, that's what a fraternity is.
For example, you have the Fraternal Order of Police today.
Okay.
That's policemen. They all have to be policemen. So it's dealing with a group of people who are all members of the same thing.
Okay.
So he's talking about it from the standpoint of the church. We are a fraternity of Christians.
So the first Corinthians 3, 14, 15 times the fraternity, and by carrying on that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God. Would that be implied fraternity?
That anytime you see an individual congregation of Christians, that would be a fraternity in that sense. There would be a fraternity in the sense of a universal church. We're all members of that same church, thus members of that same fraternity. Now then, the Bible didn't change on these matters, but the religious world sure did, didn't it? How many denominations today can you find that are organized in the way in which the Scriptures set forth? There might be some. I don't know of any. put it that way. Group of deacons many times that run the church. Sometimes deaconesses get in there too, depending on the groups. Most of them are pastor system, where whoever is the preacher is the pastor and rules the church, controls the church. Or you have organizations that are over numerous congregations and they control what they do. Recently in this area, we saw there was a split in the Methodist Church. And because you had the Methodist organization, they had to change the name because they didn't want to be associated with the Methodist anymore. They could not use legally the name and had to change all of their signs. I've forgotten what they used now, but...
What do you mean by legally? Legally applies nationhood, the nation, legal from the state nation standpoint, or legal... Legal from the state standpoint, yes. So what does the state have to do with the church? I thought they all...
The name. You cannot use the name because they have the legal rights to the name.
You mean the government, the local state, or nation involved? That's kind of weird.
And I don't know if it's federally registered or state registered. It can be probably either one. I know, for example, in the state of Texas, you legally cannot use the name of college or university without, just like a business. Yeah. They will take you out of business because go over someplace and try and start a fast food place and call it McDonald's. See what happens. Well, they do that with the name of their religious organization. And so these individuals, they wanted to withdraw from the Methodist organization, so they could not continue to use the name Methodist on the building.
One of them told me it was the Methodist Church on Wild Lake Road. He's changing out Wild Lake Church. He said it cost them $260,000 out of that
United Methodist.
That church had to pay $260,000.
Yeah. So the Bible didn't change on the organization, but man sure did. God's line of authority within the local congregation is that men, that is a plurality of men, serve as overseers who rule and direct the congregation. From a practical standpoint, you have an eldership. You appoint elders, plural. And all of them either die or resign except one. Does that one remain an elder? No. If you then appoint elders, does he automatically become an elder?
No, he ain't qualified.
Well, he better be qualified if he was an elder before. He has to be reappointed. But he better be qualified before, and he should remain qualified. But that doesn't mean he remains an elder. It happened here. It's happened other places. And yes, I know of places where they have retained one elder for a period of time until they could appoint other elders. And that is in reality wrong. when you have 2, this is a case of 2 minus 1 equals 0. That's not too good in math, but it is from a biblical standpoint in dealing with elders. These men cannot make laws that God has made or has not made. However, the decisions they make are in expediting the laws that God did make. God makes the laws, but how are we going to perform those things? How are we going to execute them? Did God give a congregation, let's see, just use Bellview congregation, the responsibility to go into all the world and preach the gospel, and in that to support preachers going into the mission field? This means yes, this means... Well, I hope everyone would be nodding yes, even though I don't see any, but... So every preacher that's going to go into the foreign field, we have the responsibility of supporting that individual, right? Where are we going to get the money? We have the authority to do it, but it's not mandatory that we support every single one. Again, where would we get the money? We'd go broke real quick. Which ones are you going to support then? Which ones are you not going to support?
What if you can afford it? I mean, you can't get blood up and turn it.
Those ones are going to do the most work. Yeah.
How do you determine effectiveness then? What do you base it on, though?
Their tax records.
No, what I'm getting at is there has to be a determination as to whether someone's being effective or not being effective. How do you determine that?
Well, I mean, that's all on the situation where they're at.
Someone, yeah, and what I'm trying to get to is that effectiveness might be different in different places. You go one place, you might see hundreds of people obeying the gospel. You go another place, and you might take years to convert 1 or 2 people. Does that mean that he's not effective in his converting 1 or 2, and the other one is? Not necessarily. My dad talked to someone when he was going to Italy, and that was basically what he was told in response. Man didn't support him. That he could take the money that it would take to support him and support someone else, and they would convert a lot more people than they would in Italy. And that was true. The only problem is sometimes you've got to do a lot of planting and watering and preparing the soil so that there can later on be conversions. Whereas some, the harvest is already ready and needs to be workers going into the field and getting the harvest. So what we boil down to, how does a congregation determine which man to support? That's where the elders come in, and they are the ones who have that responsibility. I guess everyone here would think that, for example, a television show would be pretty effective. Maybe television advertisements. Be nice, wouldn't it? Who's got the money? They have to consider as elders, okay, yes, we would like to advertise, but how? Well, maybe it's an article in the paper. Television's better. Why don't you do that? Well, we don't have the money for that and to do our other work. So we're going to do it this way. One of the things that the congregation here does, we have our services streaming over the internet. We provide a website for people to go and study. There's thousands and thousands of pages of material. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of sermons and lessons. Anyone in the world can get online and view them. Henry?
Our responsibility is to preach the word.
Yes.
The word of anybody is them the decision. We've done our work. We preach the word.
That's right. That is a good point in remembering that. Our duty is to preach the word. We cannot assure the harvest, put it that way. Their reception of it or their rejection of it. They're responsible for that. We're responsible for putting it out there.
You can tell me the one who be saved and explain to them the steps that the scriptures demands and what's the will they accept it or not?
That's a whole different matter.
They don't always
We've done our part then. But God gave the increase. And that's 1 Corinthians 3:6, I believe. But in deciding as to how we approach that, that's the elder's responsibility. And to come after the fact many times, well, the elders have decided, well, I think they should have decided this. I think they should have done this. That's wrong. They have that obligation.
Well, you're
And-
supposed to esteem them very highly for their work, say, aren't you? Supposed to-
Well, that's what it says here.
In other words.
That's what it says in the next verse.
But here it says what the elders said, they all come to the elders themselves.
Well,
Just what the elders.
I've got a section that we're going to deal with in a minute or two. Well, I'll just go ahead. That elders do have the right to get advice from others in the making that those decisions. We, as elders, making a decision as to what would be best. What do you think? What do you think? And maybe get experts' opinions. What do y'all think? And that is right. They still have the ultimate responsibility of making the decisions, but they can get advice from others. It is a wise thing to do to get advice many times. There's a lot of situations that arise. And from a personal standpoint, I don't know that much about it. I'm pretty ignorant about some of those things.
You don't support a missionary just because he says it.
Well, that would be true too. And a missionary, just because he says he's going overseas and he wants support, doesn't mean that we should support him. We don't know what he believes, what he teaches, or anything else about him, maybe.
You can send people over.
And yes, you send people over, you try to do your best in getting and ascertaining all of the information that you need in order to make decisions. And that's elders' responsibility. Well, I'll mention just a minute, the situation at Brown Trail back in years ago in which Dave Miller preached the sermon on the reevaluation and reaffirmation of elders. The difference and the way in which it was defended to a great extent at first was, well, elders have the right to get advice from the congregation. Absolutely they do, yes. That was never the problem. The problem was the elders abdicated their responsibility of making decisions and said, we're going to allow the congregation to make the decision, and as long as 75% approve, we'll remain an elder. If 25% or 26% do not approve, we're out.
There's a problem with that, with Miriam and Aaron.
Well, okay, but I'm not trying to show I'm trying to show the difference between the two. If it's asking advice, that's one thing. What could we as elders do better? What are there things that we haven't thought of? The responsibility still comes back to the elders. To abdicate the responsibility, whatever y'all decide, that's what we're going to do, is abdicating the responsibility of an elder. Notice the emphasis, the elders which are among you. An eldership cannot oversee any other group than the congregation of which they are members, that they are a part of. Nor can one eldership oversee another congregation or a multiplicity of congregations. We have had in the church even groups start up in which they're going to have a congregation and the elders are going to oversee that congregation as well. We have congregations who now have satellite congregations. Do you know what that is? Should be obvious what it means, but they have satellite congregations. They're the head congregation, and the elders are overseeing all of these other congregations.
How can you know those that are among you when you're not where they are? I don't make sense.
Well, that's the whole point we're talking about. We have congregations. In fact, Alvin Jennings several years ago wrote a book, actually 2 books, basically setting forth the idea of a head eldership in a town with all of the congregations in town submitting to that one eldership and sending all of the money to that eldership as well, by the way. Well, those things are wrong. It is the elders have to be among you. That means they have to be a part of that congregation. How can I watch for the souls of somebody in another congregation that I don't even know, that I'm not a part of? Can't do it. Not in the way in which God expects us to do that. So you have to be members of that congregation. And one of the, just from a practical standpoint now, one of the problems that we face a lot of times as someone going to a mission work, and they're supported, they have an eldership who is overseeing their work here in the States. Does that eldership also oversee the congregation that he has started there? No, they don't have that right, because that congregation is not among them. So sometimes we get into a lot of problems and difficulties along that line instead of going back to the simple the elders which are among you. That's what their work is.
Some people have a problem understanding plain English grammar in the Bible, They also learn grammar in schools or something, because what the Bible says is very clear,
I know.
I know we started second congregation in Allisonville, we had all the property. We've all built the church, got it established. We held that property until they got completely organized. Then we just transferred it back over. We didn't sell it to them, we didn't get any money, we just transferred it back to them.
Because it would not be right for this congregation to oversee a congregation in another place. Sometimes those things do take place, likened to that, but you cannot keep and try to control that congregation. They are their own congregation,
Control the internal
and they
decisions that haven't been made.
they have to develop as they should, spiritually speaking, and be able to take over that work. By the way, and since we only have a couple of minutes, I'll mention this. There's 4 ways in which a congregation is organized. All of them are, first, it is scripturally organized. That is, plurality of men serving as elders. Scripturally unorganized. What would that be? No elders. You're unorganized, but it's scriptural. Third would be unscripturally organized. That's organized according to elders and deacons, but it's unscriptural because maybe some of the men who are elders are not scriptural themselves. They're not qualified. And in that way it's sinful, but thus it's unscripturally organized. And then unscripturally unorganized. Those are the 4 categories. Now, the unscripturally unorganized could be that one man's leading the church. You have a pastor system. Not organized right as far as elders and deacons, but even in that you have for example, a Diotrephes that controls everything in the church. That would be unscripturally, and it's unorganized. So those are the 4 categories that you could find. Diotrephes, 3 John verse 9. Diotrephes, that was man's name. And he was kicking people out of the church, even John. So just read 3 John and you'll come across it in verse 9 and how that John was going to deal with him. Next week then, Lord willing, we'll start with elders are to admonish the congregation.